We now have our little bee enemy that's going to fly up and down here. But the next thing is we have no way to actually kill or stomp on these enemies. So let's start creating a system for that now. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go to my player prefab. So if I go to prefabs, I'm just going to double click on it to open it. And now in prefab edit mode, what I want to do is we have a ground check below here, and we displayed the gizmo to show how it's working. What I'm going to do is make another object here that's going to be our stomp check. So the way we're going to structure this is this collider for our player, the capsule, that's going to be used for physics and if we hit anything so we know the player dies and has to respawn. But for landing on an enemy, we're going to do a little check below here and we'll see if it hits that. So I'm going to create an empty. I'm just going to call this stomp check. And now on here, I'm going to add a box collider 2D. And I like the box collider because then it's going to cover the feed area instead of a circle. Now I don't need it nearly this big, so I'm going to make it maybe something like this, not quite so wide, and we'll move it down. So we'll put it right around here. So the idea behind this is if we land and hit an enemy in this little checkbox, then it's going to be considered that we landed on their head and we're going to destroy them. But if we hit anywhere else inside our normal collider, then we didn't land on them and it's going to cause our player to respawn. So we want to set this box to be a trigger, not a collider, because we don't want physics to work on it. And then we need to do the actual check. So a lot of the time, I usually do it right on the player object itself, and I'll make a separate script here. But a neat way to do it is if we go to our stomp check object here, we can just add a script onto this one. So I'm going to call this stomp check. Now in here, I don't need starter update. All I want is on trigger enter 2D. And then just like we did on our player, so if we go back to our player controller, at the bottom we have all these on trigger checks. We just want to do the same thing here, comparing the tag. And that brings up the next issue here is currently we're using a hazard tag for everything. So at this point, I'm going to change it a little bit where I'm going to put hazard as something that can kill the player or cause them to respawn, but we can't harm the hazard. So this is going to be something like spikes. This is going to be our little saw that moves on the ground. So any of those objects that we can't destroy, that's going to be a hazard. Now I'm going to make a new tag for enemy. So let's go back to our stomp check. So I'm going to do if collision.gameObject.compare tag, and it's enemy. So now in here, I just want to destroy that enemy. So I can do destroy collision.gameObject. So now if we hit it in that trigger box, we should destroy it, but we have to put this enemy tag on first. So let's go back to our game, exit out of our prefab here. I'm just going to save that. Now let's select this B, and if we go to the actual B object, notice we have it as a hazard. So let's change that. Let's add a tag. I'm going to call it enemy. And now we'll put that tag on our B. Now I'm also going to change it on the B. The collider on the B is currently just a trigger. So I'm going to change that. I want physics to actually work on this. So right now I'll just demonstrate here. If we run the game, if we jump on the B right now, we destroy the B. And then if we go and we move into the B, we just move through it. So I want this to actually be physics based. So I'm just going to remove this is trigger so then we don't run into confusion when we start doing checks. This could work either way, so this is more of a preference of just how I want to set it up. So let's go test this. Okay, so if I land from the top, I'm still destroying the B. But now if I hit it from the side, it has physics, so I can't walk through it, but I also don't get respawned. So first thing, let's go to our B. I'm just going to apply these prefab changes. Now let's go back to our script, and we need to go to our player controller. So the reason nothing is happening is because we're only doing checks on the onTrigger event for these tags. So we're not checking for an enemy, and we're also not checking for a collision now. So because I removed this check, this is no longer an onTrigger event, it's now an onCollision event. So I need to use onCollision enter 2D, and then everything works the exact same way. So we can just do if collision.gameObject.compareTag is enemy. Now we want to do myGameManager.playerDied. So that means we hit an enemy. So now anything that's actually moving in the environment that's an enemy, we're going to make into a collision, not a trigger anymore. So the trigger is just going to be environment objects, not enemies. Okay, so let's go test this out and make sure this works. Okay, so now if I walk into the side, I spawn, and if I come from above, I hit it. Okay, so we have a little simple system working, but we can destroy enemies now. We now have a system in place that lets us jump on an enemy and destroy them, but there's no feedback from it. So what I mean by this, if we jump on it, you can see nothing happens. We just fly right through. Now, a very important part about making games is player feedback. And we're going to go into that a lot more once we get to a section on where we make a lot of animations and particle systems and just ways to spice up the look and feel of our game. But we want to add something in there so the player gets a bit of a feedback or a reaction when this happens. Without particle systems or little explosions or something when it happens, the best thing we can do with this right now is add a bounce once we land on the enemy. So this is actually really easy to do. Let's go back to our prefabs and our player prefab. Let's double click the player prefab so we're in edit mode, and we'll go to our stomp check, and we want to open the stomp check script. Now all we need to do is when we land on this enemy and we destroy the enemy, if we go back to our player controller, when we jump, so right here we press the jump button, we add some upward velocity, which is our jump force, to make the player jump. We can do the exact same thing when we land on an enemy. So now we're going to go about this in a bit different of a way. So our stomp check object doesn't have a rigid body. The rigid body's on our player. So if we look here, our player is at the top, and this has the rigid body here, but we're working on a script on this one. So there's a few different options we can do to get access to the rigid body on the player. So you already know we can use getComponent to get the rigid body if it was on this object. So one way we can do, we could make a serialized field, make a rigid body 2D, and we'll call it player rigid body. And you're going to notice normally I call these my rigid body. Now on our player, we called it my rigid body here, like this. That's because we're on the player controller script. Actually, let me demonstrate here. If we go back here, so this script is right here, which is on the player object. And this rigid body is also on the same object. So there's no reason you have to do that. That's just a common naming convention. But what I'll do is I'll call it my if it's on the same object. Now because we're on the stomp check object here, and we're accessing the rigid body that's on the player, I don't want to call it my rigid body because it doesn't actually belong to stomp check. It belongs to player. So that's just something, you're going to make your own little systems how you get used to it, but that's the way I like to do it. So the one option we have, we make it serialized field like this. And then on stomp check, we could drag in player, and it's going to get access to the player's rigid body. So that's one way we could do it. Let me remove this here. If we want to do it just in code though, let me make a start method here. So we could do player rigid body. We can make this equal, and normally we would do getComponent rigid body 2D. Like this. So this is going to access a component on the same object. Now one way we could do it is we could actually access the transform dot parent, and then dot get component rigid body. So what this is going to do is when we put transform dot parent, it's going to, on our stomp check here, it's going to look at our transform, and then it's going to find the parent of this transform, which is player up here. So then on player, it's going to run get component and look for this component. So this is going to work as well. But the other way I like to do it, actually, if I remove this, we can do player rigid body equals. We have another one called get component in parent. And then we can do the same thing here. So this works the same way as the last one. It's just in one command. It's going to look, instead of on this object, it's going to look for the component on the parent. So now we have access to that. The next thing we need to do is we need to make a float for how much we're going to bounce. So I'll just call this bounce force. I'm going to set this to maybe 4 or 5. Let's try 5. And now if we look on player controller, so for jump, we just did my rigid body dot velocity equals a new vector 2. And we want to keep the same x value of our velocity, because this is going to be how fast our player's moving left or right. We don't want to stop them from doing that. We still want to be flowing in the same direction. We just want to add upward force, so jump. So we could actually copy this whole line. And normally I would do that, but just for your practice, let's type it in just to get the practice in. So before we destroy the enemy, let's do player rigid body dot velocity equals new vector 2. Now again, remember for the x, we want to get the player rigid body's velocity dot x and keep that. And then we want to add bounce force. Okay, and that should be all we actually need. So let's go test this out. Let's exit our prefab. Let's run the game. Now if I land on it, I get some bounce. So that already gives me much more feel of the game and makes it a lot more fun. And then once we add in some animations on those enemies and particle systems, it's going to look even much better than this.